Well, the thing is, there's two scripture passages that have the transfiguration. One is from Mark, one is from Matthew. I prepared for the readings for Matthew, and today is the readings for Mark. Fortunately, it's the same story, both in Matthew and in Mark. So even though I can't tell you about the two readings beforehand, all of which had to do with trust, as does the gospel, I was really looking forward to the story about Noah, because I was going to tell you, if I had had time, I would have remembered to put it up on the screen, but I'm not so sure that putting cartoons up is really helpful to everybody. But I thought I'd just tell you a story. It's a picture of Noah. It's a drawing of Noah. It's a single panel cartoon. And Noah is talking to one of his sons, and Noah has his hands in his pockets, and he's looking down, and the other son is looking at him, and there's the ark behind him with all the animals on it. And you read first a little line under it. It says, Noah says, "I know I was commanded only to take 2 of every creature, but my wife insisted." And when you look, there's 100 cats on top of the on top of the ark. So anyway, boy, I'm glad this wasn't my first day here. Wow, boy. Well, a lot of when we look to see what can be said about the scriptures, I always like to do a little bit of research rather than just coming up with my own thoughts. And this time I was led to Father Michael K. Marsh. He's a priest of the Episcopal Church. He was writing in 2017, and I use a lot of his thoughts here. I had some of mine in it, and I rearranged them in some ways. But he served as rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Uvalde, a parish in West Texas. Since 2005, he was assigned there. He's married. He had 2 sons. His older son died in a work-related accident in 2009. And what I share with you, he wrote in 2017. Now, you will no doubt recall that in 2022, 19 children and 2 adults were killed in a shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde on May 24th, 2022, the deadliest shooting ever at a Texas school. So here's what he says with regard to the disciples going up to the mountain and coming down. This is what he says to us. Father Marsh says, "As hearers of the word, and as people who acknowledge Christ as the center of our belief," remember, this is a man speaking after his son was killed in a work accident. "As hearers of the word and as people who acknowledge Christ as the center of our belief, we have the unique opportunity to reflect on our own encounters with the divine and the significance of these moments in our faith journey as we come to know the ups and downs of life." Speaking from experience, he says, like the disciples, we need to, in faith and trust, bridge the extraordinary experience of the Transfiguration with the everyday realities of discipleship, emphasizing the sustenance that such mountaintop experiences provide during the ups and downs in life. And importantly, to help us recognize the enduring presence of Christ in our lives. And he says, fostering a resilient faith that can thrive not only in moments of spiritual elevation, the mountaintop moment, the Transfiguration, but also amid the challenges of daily life. He says this. He says, "I suspect every one of you could tell stories about the changes that you have experienced, the changes that are happening in your life right now, or the changes that you hope for, or that you fear may happen." He says, how do we live in the midst of change? What handholds are there when it seems the world around us, as well as within us, is changing? He says, I wonder if the disciples in the Transfiguration Gospel might be asking the same kind of questions. If they too are feeling the wind of change blowing through their lives. And he says, here's why I say that. Immediately before Jesus takes Peter, John, and James up the mountain, he tells them and the other apostles that he must suffer, die, and be raised up on the 3rd day. He will tell them this again after they come down from the mountain. He says, what happened on that mountaintop took place between Jesus' two statements of impending change and doom. The Son of Man must suffer much at the hand of the elders and be put to death and to rise again. And prior to going up to the mountain to pray, they knew that Jesus was continuing to take his journey through Jerusalem, knowing that people were plotting to kill him. He says this: maybe the Transfiguration story has something to teach and show us about how to live in the midst of fear, how to live in the midst of doubt. The scripture says, listen to him. And suddenly there was no one else with Jesus except Jesus. Elijah and Moses had disappeared. It was only Christ, and a voice from the heavens came and said, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. Now, Father Marsh says this: one of the things I'm aware of in the midst of change is how many voices begin to speak. He says some are outside of me and some are from within. And then he says this, which is so, even though he wrote this in 2017, he says, there are voices of commentators chattering about what is happening and what should be done. Voices of judgment, voices of second guessing, voices of fear. Some voices tell us to run and hide. Others tell us to fight and resist. Some voices ask questions and want explanations. Other voices deny what is happening, blame or declare it to be the end of the world. He says so many voices cry out for our attention. Not every voice, however, is helpful or worth listening to. So many voices cry out for our attention, but not every voice is helpful or worth listening to. He says some voices may sound sweet, but they are not good for us. The story of the Transfiguration says there is only one voice to listen to, the voice of God. He says, what if in the midst of change, we, the followers, the disciples of Jesus, sought to hear and listen to that one voice, the voice of Christ the Beloved? What if we kept our ears open to what Christ is saying in our life and in the world today? To let ourselves become aware of and attentive to what Christ is saying and doing, to let his concerns and desires become our concerns and desires, to let his way of engaging life in the world become our way of engaging life in the world. He says it would mean that whatever change comes upon us, it does not have the final word. Whatever change comes upon us, it does not have the final word. There is another voice. Jesus is always speaking, a word larger and more powerful than all the other voices that compete for attention. He says in the midst of change, Jesus speaks a word of life. In the midst of change, Jesus speaks a word of hope. In the midst of change, Jesus speaks a word of forgiveness. In the midst of change, Jesus speaks a word of mercy. Jesus speaks a word of beauty. Jesus speaks a word of generosity. Jesus speaks in the midst of change a word of courage, a word of love, and a word of healing. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. He then says, Jesus speaks a word to you and for you and for me. He says, are we listening to that word, to his voice?